But Jay-Z, in terms of what that means to you and what that means as you understand Ramtha's imperatives on teaching us how to do that, how would you explain it?
Well, first I would like to address pre-space, Basil's terminology of pre-space, to where he refers to Ahmed as that's the realm that you can find consciousness in. I agree, but I also disagree, because if consciousness is only located in a place that is outside time and space, then we have no understanding as to the mind quality that brought about the concepts of deterministic manifestation, nor do we have a mind that is able to justify time and space, or at least endeavor to justify time and space, and to try to figure out how all of this got here. In my simplistic mind, consciousness is the ground of all being, and that pre-space is its headwaters, and that when we look at the concept of gravity, that we're actually studying an intangible phenomenon that is most akin to willful intent upon the Creator's part. And the Creator, again, let me point out, is any and every individual, that there is an overall mind to reality that has held this reality into an intentional plan. And therein, I think gravity, along with the strong and weak nuclear forces, all come together to represent, in a spiritual context, the word will. And that consciousness is the very thing of time fluctuations, that it is the very element to where quantum mechanics begins and ends and moves into free space. And having said that, then, I could say that the way that I've been taught about how to create something out of nothing is that I have to be able to visualize in my carnal neural net the concept that nothing can be as visual to me as an undulating field of energy, and that energy carries with it a potential signature, that I don't see random particles falling like snowfall from pre-space, and from that randomness of particles, suddenly there is a coagulation of fields that brings about my desire. Rather, and for me, for my visual concept, I see rather that it's an energy, and that from that energy is pliable to the conscious thought that's given to it. So in my mind, I see energy fields undulating and then collapsing into particle form, having a nucleus of information that allows them to be bound together, and bound together by gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces. And that constitutes, that thing constitutes my desire of creation.
Made tangible.
Made tangible. But again, if consciousness and energy is everything, then Basil is also correct when he says that he has a problem with energy. I mean, the electron all they contract is the cloud of it. If he has a problem with energy being in terms of relevant to particle activity, and he sees it as an unfolding or an infolding back into the implicate order, he is also correct. It's just, in my mind, and not as brilliant as these esteemed professors here, I have to see an action, that from that action I can lay the thought in and see the action become molded to the pattern of my thought.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you if you want to make a short concluding statement, and then we'll take a break. Anybody want to go first? Respond to...
Go ahead.
Amit?
To JC. As you were completely right about consciousness, of course. When I was referring to Basil's pre-space, I was not referring to consciousness being confined to free space, of course not. What I was referring to is that when you do the mathematics, at some point, a logical impasse will arise. And it was at that point that concepts such as free space would come in, and that logical impasse, again, would have the window for consciousness to come into the picture.
But do you understand what Basil is saying about, in other words, quantum mechanics runs out when you run out of time and space, and that there has to be, there's something beyond that element that he calls...
Quantum mechanics turns out that exactly means the same thing as I'm talking about in logical impossibility. See, consciousness is outside of quantum mechanics. Has to be in order to be the collapser, in order for us to be the observer, in order for us to have free will. So there we are all agreeing, I think. This slight thing that I was trying to clarify is important because one has to recognize what you said to be the correct position about consciousness, that consciousness is all. Therefore, nothing is outside consciousness in that sense. On the other hand, there is a transcendent aspect of consciousness, which is where things become somewhat intricate, because transcendence is both in and out. And therefore, this concept, it has to be used in a rather subtle way and may produce difficulties. For example, I thought what you reacted to was that you thought we are restricting consciousness to free space, which I don't think we are. Okay?
Okay.
Is that correct, Basil?
I just want to make some comments on that in order to summarize. The first point I want to make is really a confession. I do not really understand the word consciousness. That is my problem. It is used in so many different ways with so many connotations. I thought that when I was using it here and agreeing with you that we were agreeing on what it meant, but I'm not quite so sure now. First of all, another point is the notion of pre-space. The notion of pre-space is not that it is a container. The notion of pre-space is, for me, that's all there is. That is the very essence, the totality, the ultimate quantum monad.
It's not outside of space.
No.
That's why transcendence has to be understood.
Okay.
It transcends space, but not
yes,
outside
and
of space.
space actually can be constructed from it. That's the point I was trying to make.
And
All
within it.
manifestations
And within it. That's right. Okay.
Could I ask you, Amit Goswami, for our audience and for Basil, to define consciousness?
Well, you know, my standard answer to this is that we should not be too uptight about defining consciousness. What is a definition? Definition is trying to describe something in terms of something else. Consciousness is the ground of all being. It is the one absolute that we know. So if we could describe consciousness completely in terms of words, then consciousness would be secondary to those words. You see that? Therefore, we should always leave that not this aspect of Eastern traditions. Not this is one way of approaching consciousness, because those great sages of the ancient times recognized that there is something unknowable about consciousness. In Judaism, it's, God's name is YEWH or something, some consonant. There's no vowel in Judaism. Yahweh is the way we put it. But really it's unspeakable. And that unspeakable element is important to keep. So we say some things about consciousness, but we should be very clear that we should not be able to define consciousness completely. Consciousness is the ground of all being, is as close as we can get. Yeah. But it's just a descriptor. But is the ground of all being self-aware? Well, that's the point. How is it self-aware? I mean, we shouldn't say is it self-aware. We should say how is it self-aware. You see the slight difference. In other words, science begins when we start answering this kind of how question, and how is it self-aware is what Self-Aware Universe, my book, is all about. So that's the relevant question. But is it self-aware is a much more difficult question, or probably an imponderable question, because that refers to consciousness in its suchness. Consciousness in its suchness had that element in it which we should be always very respectful, that indescribable element in it, because it is the only being.
Okay. Carol, you have something you want to say before we take a break?
I do, and basically, I guess perhaps because I'm a bioengineer first before I was a physicist, I'm very concerned about practical ways of doing things. It's the engineer in me, I suppose. And I guess what I raised this with Basil last year, but my own particular orientation is that in terms of a practical way of approaching an internal understanding of these things, we must step back a step from quantum concerns and look at what is ubiquitous amongst us, and that is something which is still fairly poorly understood, and that is the electronic and photonic nature of the universe. It is in the nature of light and the study of light that I believe that a great deal light will be shown upon this area where there is still obviously a great deal of controversy. And I make that assumption based upon the historical existence of light in every religious practice since time immemorial. Light, first, let there be light. They're always, in every discipline, Judeo-Christian, shamanic, Yamamani in the South America, there is always something to do with light and the existence of light. So as a scientist who has been struggling with these same kinds of questions and looking for the same sorts of answers, it just occurs to me that maybe a step backward is a place to find at least a practical approach to get to the next step. And I'm saying this all rather rhetorically. I don't really expect any response or comment at this point, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. JC, do you want to have anything you want to say as a wrap-up before we take a break?
Oh, it's been wonderful.
Now, during the next portion of our discussion, the conversation will be enlarged now to include the other invited presenters who are seated in the front of the room. And after that discussion has progressed for 15 or 20 minutes, we will then expand the discussion to include the rest of you. And at that point, we'll ask those of you who are observers who have questions, if you will queue up at the microphones on each side, we'll take your questions. And I'll let you know when that portion of the proceedings, when we reach that. If you will formulate your questions carefully and succinctly, we'll certainly look forward to entertaining them a little bit later this morning. Now the floor is open for those of you who are other presenters. There was a question over here. Susan?
Yes, I have a question for Professors Haile and Goswami. What about magic? What about the techniques taught at the Ramtha School of Enlightenment? Materialization, alchemy. Is this stuff possible? Does it work, and can it be taught?
It's a very good question. I have to go into a little bit of esoteric detail. See, when you do this with the new science based on consciousness, then you get into a picture of involution and evolution of consciousness. In other words, cosmology, as traditionally taught, is that the world comes around first, there is a big bang, and then matter grows, and somehow matter becomes life, and life becomes mind, and all this. This is very different in spiritual cosmology. There you start with consciousness, and consciousness forms a body of laws, and then you have mind, and then you have vital body, and then finally matter and then matter evolves, and then this vital body and mental body are mapped onto the physical, and this is what life and mind is. Now, the new science is supporting this spiritual view, spiritual cosmology. When you do it this way, then you see that the first thing in this journey of involution is to set limits on consciousness. Consciousness is unlimited, begins in an unlimited way. First limit is the limit of laws, scientific laws. But it is within consciousness. So even the laws are within consciousness. That gives us a hint that ultimate creativity entails actually even going beyond these laws. But I say that with extreme caution and trepidation, because one can misunderstand this. Does that mean that anybody can do havoc, create havoc in the physical world? No, because the precondition of that level of identity is a liberated existence in which the selfishness, or in other words, the being is so tuned to love, being is so tuned to universal oneness, that nothing can happen that will topple the order that was intended to be set up by this lawfulness. If I made any sense.
Okay. Bob?
Yes, I was just going to say, I think I agree. I couldn't put it better myself. And one of the things that always worries me is that saying this kind of thing does give, in some people's minds, the possibility of creating havoc. What I feel that we should do is to actually find out what the laws are that lie beyond quantum theory, and to slowly articulate them and to see what is possible in that scheme. In other words, this is the conservative physicist speaking here. They're always worried about going too far from what they already know, because you can speculate like mad and it's never clear whether it's pure speculation or whether it is reflected in reality as you see it. So I would just say be cautious.
Yes, Tony.
My question is for Professor Goswami. I'm interested in what could be called the crisis of legitimation of the modern Western worldview. I think we're in trouble in the way we've been viewing the world. I'm also interested in how what are called emergent religions have consistently offered an alternative to what we see as the dualistic worldview. And when I hear you speak, it's almost as if I'm hearing the Upanishads, the Abhidharma, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Gita. So I wonder if you would comment on the consistency of Ramtha's teaching in ancient Eastern scriptures.
Thank you for that question. It is not a coincidence. In other words, when science finally joins the idea that consciousness is the ground of being, if we are able to develop science properly, then clearly this science must be in consistency with the spiritual teachers. The reason for this is very simple. Spirituality is not as commonly understood by people, misunderstood mostly, because spirituality is identified with religions who follow a dogma. But spirituality is not about following dogma. Spirituality is about knowing yourself. I was delighted that the name of our conference is In Search of the Self, or something of that sort, which is very appropriate, because that's what spirituality is about. So when we search for reality in that sense, then we are really looking at people who have already have done that search, and the esoteric traditions are really empirical data. It is very sad that scientists today are unable to see that this spiritual traditional work, they are not postulates, they are not philosophizing, such as in the tradition of Western philosophy that started in the 16th and 17th century. This esoteric traditional work is not philosophy in this modern sense. but it's seeing a level of reality that can be seen only with very patient work with ourselves. Meditation is one of the ways that we do the patient work, involves advanced and advanced, more and more advanced techniques. So in this school, I'm very heartened. I just came here, this is my second time. But what I saw and discussed even my first time, I was impressed that it is a school in the tradition of wisdom school. And when it is that way, then you see people are investigating, and the investigation will reveal the same signposts that are in the Vedanta, that are in the Upanishads, that are in the wise books of the West, that are in every tradition. There will be minor differences, because that too is understandable, because these new avenues are not going to be completely objective. Subjectivity comes in, because as I said earlier, if you have mathematical objective view of the world, you can never entertain creativity or free will. So subjectivity is bound to enter, and because of that, there will be minor discrepancies in the views, but they will all be minor. The major signposts will always be the same, because they are empirically founded upon. And we are just very beautifully living in a time where we can even build a scientific theory for these empirical findings.
Are you saying that actually bringing together science and spirituality is really a function of the modern world, that the people that you talked about before that wrote the ancient scriptures were in fact sort of scientists themselves because they were experiencing the reality?
Scientists of consciousness, their science was based on experience. And after all these centuries, the one advancement about which I am very proud, Abner Shimony calls it experimental metaphysics. I think we finally can do one thing that the ancients were unable to do, which is that we can even do consensus experiments to verify some of the ontological statements that we make about reality. This the ancients could not do. I mean, usually could not do. There were demonstrations of a sort. Occasionally, like miracles are a demonstration in a sense. But now we can do more than, miracles are being exception to the laws. They prove consciousness in a very roundabout way, in a way. But within the laws now, we can do verification of the metaphysical statement. So that's an advancement. So if you ask if there were scientists, yes, there were scientists. The only thing that qualifies that is that it was experiential science and not in the experimental sense that we interpret science today. And perhaps we are taking it one step further with experimental metaphysics.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I'd like to follow up the last question by asking Basil Hiley. Do you think that these ancient scientists, including, of course, Ramtha, have anything to offer modern science at its present juncture?
I think there's a lot that they can offer, because scientists have tried to exclude this particular realm completely, and therefore they are very ignorant, speaking for myself, of this realm. And therefore any experience could be very useful, could be very helpful for them in their particular tasks, in trying to, whether you could actually get a mathematical theory, which is one of my pet hobby horses, to do this, I'm not sure, but I would be certainly very interested in listening and seeing if it fitted in to the particular scheme that I was trying to develop, or the particular line I was trying to develop. So I'd say yes, it could be very helpful.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah. The word meaning has come up a lot in your discussions, and meaning is something that I've been interested in for a long time, and in a practical way, not in a philosophical way. There seem to be there's some empirical evidence, I mean empirical, tangible, objective, quantitative evidence, that there are individual differences in people's capacity to perceive meaning in a set of data that appears randomly distributed to other people. Now it turns out that this capacity to perceive meaning in data that appear randomly distributed is correlated positively I can even give you the magnitude of the correlation between it's correlated positively with hypnotic ability. In other words, people who are high on hypnotic ability appear to see meaning in events that other people can't see. A practical demonstration of that is that, for example, engineers, their hypnotic ability is correlated with the number of patents they have to their name. In other words, there's a correlation between creativity and hypnotic ability. Now the question, as we've been talking about is implicate and explicate universe, which I know nothing about. But the ability to find meaning in something that appears randomly distributed to others, I'm wondering how, if any way, that might interface with this concept of implicit, explicit, and maybe it has no interface.
The real difficulty in answering that question is that I'm not sure I understand hypnosis. What is going on? You know, what happens to the cell, the neuron structure, etc., under hypnosis. And therefore it's rather difficult to answer that question. But certainly the thing that I found particularly with David Bohm was that he was of this nature. Now whether you could easily hypnotize him or not, I don't know, because I was never in that situation. But he could certainly see hidden orders in things very much more quickly than others. But I was never able to actually fathom out what it was that he was doing that enabled him to do this. And I have a feeling it might be something deep in the neural structure rather than something outside. And okay.
If I can, let me add to that a little bit. I really think that it is outside of the neural order. Matter cannot capture meaning. Meaning has to be seen in the mind. Matter cannot capture meaning is very easy to prove. A computer scientist gave me the best proof that I know. Computers process symbols. They are symbol processing machine. Suppose you try to include meaning as saying that, well, these symbols will just tell the meaning of other symbols. But you analyze the process and you recognize immediately that we will then need additional symbols to tell us the meaning of the meaning symbols. And that process goes on ad infinitum, and not surprisingly, because there is a very famous mathematical theorem called Gödel's theorem, which tells us that all logical systems sufficiently elaborate would be incomplete or inconsistent. So there's again a logical impossibility of finding meaning in matter itself. So where does meaning of matter come from? This is the point I was trying to make. The ancients knew about this. So they introduced the mental body, vital body. These are precisely conveying the meaning of the physical. In other words, physical maps it, like the software can be mapped in the hardware, but it's coming from the mind of the programmer. So when we recognize it that way, then you see an answer can be given to your question. Because hypnosis and creativity both are ways to get out of the structures that are conditioned within us. Hypnosis is well known for making us creative because it enables a part of our mind that is connected to the conditioned structure to be at bay for the moment. It frees us from that. Creativity, of course, is jumping out from the conditioned mind, period. That is the definition of creativity. It's the discovery of new meaning, if you will. So it's not at all surprising that there is such a high correlation.
This is an empirical event.
Yes, yes.
It's not theory.
Yes, yes.
It's documentable.
Very nice. In fact, I'm going to quote you in my book on creativity.
I call that surplus pattern recognition. Because sometimes this is, from a biological evolutionary point of view, this may be adaptive under some conditions. Under other conditions, it may be maladaptive. For example, if the meanings you see in the world are always negative, then you will develop depression, you develop physical stress-related disease. On the other hand, if the meanings you see in the world tend to be positive, you may spiral the other way.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to add to your question as well. Just coming from the basis of being taught by Ramtha in regards to the self, both are integrated here, that a state of hypnosis involves both mass, which is the brain, which I've referred to earlier on as the biocomputer, as well as states of mind of self. And essentially what we have been taught in a very simplistic form is that when we can move into a light trance state, we are essentially moving into a hypnotic state. Biologically speaking and neurologically speaking, that means a moving from the self as altered ego personality neocortex into the high midbrain area. So we're looking at another faculty of the brain or the computer itself that is attuned to a different frequency ratio than the neocortex itself. And through that process, we are able to mediate our self as a spiritual self, the mental body that would allow a much broader and much more creative form to come through. So essentially, we have the computer to which we can program day-to-day events. We have the computer to which we can put in another program and to modify day-to-day events in a more creative, expanding, and thus much more meaningful manner. So the process of finding intuition, for example, the process of finding meaning to something that in our ordinary life stumps us, we are taught to be able to move physiologically into a different part of the brain. That aspect of the brain taps in a higher quality, if you will, of the aspect of ourself, which is our mind, that gives us a much more expanded and much more rounded view of the problem that we've addressed. And so in this, I see the hypnosis viable, is a movement from a utility of the brain to a higher order of the brain, to access greater information that on a day-to-day basis we don't usually call upon.
Okay, we're going to take one more question from participants, and then the floor will be open for the rest of you. Those of you who have questions, if you'll begin to queue up to either this microphone or this microphone, we'll take those questions after the next one. So, yes, Stan.
I have a question for Jay-Z. It's always been very interesting to me that Ramtha chose quantum physics as something that he wanted you to learn about and wanted the students to learn about. Now, why quantum physics instead of psychoneuroimmunology, natural selection, human genetics, any number of other fields which might be, on the surface of things, equally important in understanding his teachings? Why do you think he chose quantum physics? Has he ever told you?
Well, actually, it wasn't just quantum mechanics on the field of evolution in regards to our evolving genetic structures that evolve according to our interactions in our environments. We have been taught about all the way down to how a gene is encoded that then can be passed on to the second and third and fourth generations, how that encoding happens, how we then tie in evolution, the evolving species of humanity that is also married to the evolving aspect of making known the unknown. In other words, don't go back to the next life and keep doing over and over again what you've done in subsequent lives. We have now in prior existences through the genetic pool have evolved through mind, environment, and experiences genetic species that would be attainable to an evolving spirit that needed to come back here and, for example, to be able to bring up new concepts of thought, bring forth meaning into those thoughts, collapse those thoughts as thought form patterns into a field of viable energy, create tangible reality, move through that tangible reality, gain the experience of that from gaining that experience, we gain the utility of not only expanding ourselves on all the levels of mind, but we also have expanded ourselves in regards to our genetic pool. So we've been taught that every action is not simply an effect that is located only at the quantum level, but that the body itself is a quantum machine, and that genetics is a quantum machine, and that we're here to evolve those principles. So he's taught all of those sciences to us, to where in our mind we can then take and put forward a reasonable and logical explanation for many of the phenomenons or the questions that each of us and perhaps most of the people in the world have asked. Who am I? Why am I here? Have I lived before? Will I live again? And what is the meaning of my life, and how does it affect the whole? So yes, we have been given all of these sciences.
If I could add just something tagging on to that, Stan. To further sort of extrapolate what Jay-Z said, your question was why those particular subjects? Why quantum physics? An answer might be found if you look at Bill Tiller's formalism of how science in the traditional sense has unfolded and how this new science might unfold. In the traditional sense, structure, chemistry, energy were the way we looked at things. So if we look at consciousness as primary, then consciousness, spirits, energy, electromagnetics, energy, chemistry, and structure being the very tail end of the thing. So by approaching what I guess Rupert Sheldrake would call a morphogenetic approach to looking at answering some of Ian's questions, we can structure our knowledge in a new way, because obviously the school is about doing things in a new way.
Okay, thank you. There's a question over here. If you'll just state your name and
my question.
tell us what you want to know.
My name's Bill Hashem, and I've enjoyed the dialogue thus far. And my question was first prompted by Carol's initial presentation and then the initial dialogue. And one of my favorite ecologists, Aldo Leopold, says the prairie, the elm prairie, is made up of pines, firs, oaks, grouse, flowers, and grass. And he says if we pick a flower, it changes the whole system. And he also says this imponderable essence is the noumenon of material things. So I'm going to give a different spin to some of the questions thus far. In the school, we are taught to ponder the imponderable and to experience firsthand the noumenon. And in science, what you ponder seems to be the next logical step, and you can't experience the noumenon because the noumenon is that which needs to be measured and seen and heard and all of that. So how can these two seemingly divergent fields, the fields of spirituality and the fields of science, converge? And I'm wondering, like to have Carol and Jay-Z answer, what does the spiritual side need from science, if that's even possible, and what does science need from the spiritual movement to make that convergence happen?
Well, I'll start it off. For me, the practice of science is what I like to do. Who I am and who I am becoming is my spiritual practice, my spiritual discipline, the thrust of my life. It's my hope that the journey I'm on right now as a scientist trying to blend these two is going to lead me to something new. The very fact that this conference even exists is strong evidence that, at least personally, I'm on the right track. What it has helped me to do historically, just to give a little empirical proof, if that's an appropriate term, is by learning the disciplines of consciousness and energy that we learn in this school. I have been enabled to accomplish a great many things in the very practice, day-to-day practice of conducting research, which I do for a living, that have helped me and benefited me greatly, beyond any linear accounting of those particular events. I won't go into all of them, but it is, let me just say, it's opened the doors and opened my eyes to see things in an innovative way. And innovation for a scientist is the key thing. That's what you're after.
What was your question? What about science? I'm sorry.
Which part of my ultimate question is how science can use the spiritual movement and how the spiritual movement can use what science has to offer, and how to bring a converging of these two seemingly divergent disciplines.
Well, in my simple way, I see science as a handmaiden to understanding life and reality. In some schools of thought, it's the new religion, that in order to believe in science and to believe in it, you should, gives credibility and somewhat, although dry meaning to one's life. It explains the bump in the night, and it explains how fast and the velocity that a train is going down the tracks at 70 miles an hour and what that means and all of that. To me, I find science a handmaiden, an area of human exploration that helps to explain in scientific theory and scientific proof more about the world around me, and in theory in particular, I'm most concerned with about the world that I don't see. I don't want to see the world as simply a nebulous pool of nothing to which phantoms emerge and disappear without understanding where they come from. Science, in particular, this field of quantum mechanics and working it and blending it with consciousness helps me to understand, and I think for the most part, everyone here in the school, so that we have a real basis in saying we can create reality in our life. We have the tools to do that. We've been taught the theory of how that's possible. And all we have to do is then to apply the tools in the theory, and it should equal self-created reality. And this is what we've done. So science has taken away, in a sense, the mysticism, or it has taken away the veils that have never been able to explain what extraordinary people do, and what common people do that are extraordinary. In what the field of the school can do for science, I see the school and the work that is being accomplished here by Ramtha and his students as a human living laboratory, to where the theories that have been postulated from these physicists and the theory of quantum mechanics, or consciousness being the ground of all being, that here is a place to where you can come and study the theory instead of setting up experiments in the lab with lengthy mathematical equations to endeavor to explain it. Here, you get to see that process in work because it's what our teachers told us works. It is applicable to the theory in some areas that we've studied, and so I think for those who have an open mind and not afraid to tangle the observer, I think we have a lot to offer.
Ahmet and Basil?
It's a very good question. Requires a very careful answer. I think that what Jay-Z said, I basically agree with. There is much for science to offer to spirituality and vice versa. Reason is, of course, that science in its ideal is not concerned so much with the details or so much with what the next logical step is. In the ideal, science also looks for reality. So when we look beyond what normally scientists do, most scientists do, instead look at what the creative scientist is doing, then I think you already know the answer. Creative scientist is trying to investigate reality the same way as the mystic, the spiritual teacher is. So, and they would find very similar things. So what can science learn from the spiritual traditions? Science has now been faced with paradoxes, anomalies of a great number. Quantum physics is just one of the number of paradoxes that has baffled modern science. So one answer, I think it's the answer, is to reform science to include consciousness. And when you do that, we find that consciousness includes science. It's not the other way around. In other words, science must be based on the idea that consciousness is the ground of all being. So when science does that, then science itself takes a quantum leap beyond ordinary science, because ordinary science always has concerned itself only with the material level of reality. Henry Stapp, a Berkeley physicist who recently studied some of these other bodies, mental bodies and vital bodies, he went to India to study a scheme, Vedantas, for doing that. And when he came back, he said that this is really very interesting, because these traditions look at mental and the vital as very objective ways that science actually can investigate. So he is looking forward to a new science that will be applicable to the vital body, to the mental body. So we are looking for a quantum leap in scientific progress for the next century. We have almost done with the material level of reality. Now the new science will investigate the vital and the mental level of reality, the meaning of meaning, if you will. And so that's the kind of thing that science is learning from spiritual traditions. What can spiritual traditions learn from science? Well, scientists too represent a very, very good way of investigating. I mean, scientists have concentration, they have fixity of purpose. They represent, I think, a good open-minded bunch of creative people. And their methodologies are not that foreign to the spiritual traditions either. So what spiritual traditions can learn from science is partly this methodology, but partly also with quantum physics, for example, we can understand why certain spiritual processes like meditation work. It's very beautiful, this new understanding that is coming, even very esoteric states of consciousness. What is the distinction between dream and samadhi, and a state of ecstasy? This kind of thing, when you look at from the scientific point of view, from a quantum theoretic point of view, all of a sudden start making sense. You can make a model of yourself in a way that you couldn't before. And that clarity will help us in terms of arriving at these exalted states. Because you know, the first step of getting to something to experience is first to understand what you are going to experience. So always a good thing to start with a solid basis of understanding. And science, I think, is providing that.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question here.
Thank you. My name is Pedro Gutierrez, and first of all, I wish to thank JZ for manifesting this magnificent conference with this distinguished panel of scholars, some of whom I'm quite familiar with, and also for the great manifestation of Carol Koffs and myself. We discussed this a long time ago, the bridge of science and spirituality. I have a question and a comment for Professor Hiley. I wish to acknowledge your book as being probably one of the foremost contributions to the foundations of physics in the past 10 years. I think this is a great courage to have the great daring to write about the ontology of interpreting physics and quantum theory. So along those terms, I wish to ask a question. Would you be kind enough to elaborate in simple, non-mathematical terms the ontological implications of the quantum potential and superquantum potentials as it appertains or relates to the implicate order and free space, which is what we call the void?
Thank you.
In a few minutes.
Well, thank you, first of all, very much for the compliments about the book. I wish David was here. He never actually saw that appear in print, and this always disappointed me because he died while it was in the process. He was a little bit apprehensive. I'm not answering the question. He was a little bit apprehensive about that book appearing because he'd already been through the criticisms from his fellow physicists in the 50s for trying those ideas. And what saddens me was that he died in that apprehension, whereas in fact if he'd lived, he would have seen a tremendous appreciation from a wide variety of physicists. I mean, Chris Isham from Imperial College actually said that was the best book that was written on quantum mechanics for the last 20 years. So it is appreciated amongst fellow physicists as well. And this is not me bragging about it, because I think that's David's book. I was just there to facilitate the production of it. Now then, the answer to the physics side of it without being too complicated and too long. What I talked about today has been through the implicate order, which normally when I present this, if I have enough time, I go through the quantum potential approach first and then show how it follows. But what I attempted to do is to try and get rid of that, because the quantum potential approach for me was really a question of saying, let's try and get a formalism for quantum mechanics which is much closer to the classical formalism, so that we can actually put our fingers on what the difference actually is in terms of the mathematical structure. Because to explain, the quantum mechanics is normally formulated in a way that has no resemblance to classical physics whatsoever. It's an entirely new ball game. It's like leaping out into some other yard and playing something entirely different. And then when it comes to trying to find out what the essential differences are, you're stumped. So that was that attempt, and in that attempt we found that in fact just by rewriting the Schrödinger equation there was a new term which appeared, which is this quantum potential. And when we tried to analyze that quantum potential, we found that it came from a field which was totally unlike any field that was present in classical physics. It was a field which we liken to a field of information, and we actually use the idea of active information and passive information and inactive information. And it was because of that link with information that we began to think, well, maybe this is the place where this particular approach to quantum mechanics is coming to, where the brain begins to intercede in physical process. Not the same way as Armitage doing it, but this is this way of doing it. And then when we pushed that a bit further, we saw that there was a, when we went to the field theory, we then find that there was a super quantum potential. And then in principle there could be a quantum potential above that and a quantum potential above that. And this would lead into more subtle and subtler forms of matter. Ultimately, maybe even reaching thought. And so we had this hierarchy, and this is where, and right at the end of the hierarchy is where the consciousness is that Amit is talking about. So the connection with the implicate order then is to really, it's really a jump in a way, because you see a trace of the idea of this hierarchy of, as it were, feeding in information for the process, changing the process. A bit like the morphogenetic field, I think that's been mentioned before. Not a push-pull potential, but altering the structure of the morphology so that it's a subtle approach. And now you look at that as jumping to the implicate order. When the particle emerges, goes back again into the vacuum state, comes out again, what controls that is essentially the translation of the implicate order and the super-implicate order and so on. Sorry, the superquantum potential and the, I beg your pardon, the quantum potential and the superquantum potential. So that is where the link between the two sides actually comes. And one of the things that I've been doing is, with some students, is to try and study the very nature of the quantum potential and how it arises from the implicate order, from the deeper point of view. Does that answer the question?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, but what I was inferring from this is that perhaps what I understand from this, and other associates and physicists of mine also implicate, is that there is a nested order of information and intelligence, which is an implicate order, and perhaps this is what the ancients call the divine intelligence or cosmic intelligence. And the last thing is that thank you for being here. This was really something I wanted to ask you many years ago and finally had a chance to. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much. You have time for one more question. Gordon?
I'd like to get into another gap that we have been experiencing, that is the gap between natural science and social science, and those of us who are in the humanities. I picked up the idea that quantum represents a real paradigm shift in our worldview and our cosmology. Also in social science now, we're talking about order, reality being a social construct. And in more radical presentations of that is that everything that we do with the world, we construct ourselves. There is no order out there. All the order is from our minds to the phenomena we observe. The question is, if we accept the paradigm shift, would you venture some guesses as to how we who are in the humanities and the social sciences, the psychological sciences, might want to change our methodologies of how we approach our research? I'd particularly like to hear Jay-Z speak to this as well. But it's the questions for the whole panel. But you know, if we were to buy into Ramtha, how? I mean, we've already written our papers, so we're safe. How would you see us changing our research?
I think without stepping on any religious toes and without destroying any dogma, just as a personal explanation, I would see that perhaps what would be in order is a redefining of God, not as some superimposed being who has already got the order going and we're simply victims on the stage of circumstance. To see God then more defined in a personal sense, and that if we take God from out there and put him in here, or her or it in here, and we say then let's take that definition and make it your definition. And then let's understand then that what God is then is the collective mind, or as Jung suggested, the collective unconscious, to where we all agree that reality, this world that we've been born into, is being carried over from our forefathers, and that the stage is set, has already been held into place. It's their order, previous generations' order, as God also, that has set the stage and their dynamics of thought into life. And that if we, as simple people, could emerge with an understanding that we are sparked as that divine mind, and that we have the capacities to reconstruct our world and to reconstruct our social systems, and that we are imbued with real power in which to do that, instead of being defeated by what we've inherited, that in a sense that God's greatest work is through us to change, to modify, to uplift, to progress. On a social level, I see that and would like to have seen that personally, that more people would know that, and to be able to have the empowerment that everyone, regardless of what religion and regardless of what creed or nationality, it doesn't make it, we're all human beings, that we are imbued with the divine, and that through these processes that we are also empowered to make better our world. And I just want to make a comment too on what was asked in the first question about this destroying the laws, scientific laws, or operating outside of those. There's always this human fear that if you step outside the boundary of law, that somehow it means the destruction. But on the other hand, I feel that when rightly taught and rightly understood as individual self, that law would never be destroyed in as much as it would be expanded, and that to credit ourselves with destroying everything that we have and running wild and doing all these sorts of things, I think is an ignorant misnomer. I feel quite the contrary. And it is through redefining God to the personal that allows us to expand those boundaries to better our social system and to better our lives and to better our world in general. That's my answer.
Okay.
I would love to respond to that as well.
Okay, you got 1 minute.
Okay. And I feel it's important to say this, so I wouldn't drag it on. So, along with what Jay-Z said, it I think is going to require some tough choices in the humanities. And primarily, and I come from a background in the humanities, my undergraduate degree is in neuroscience, but the idea of personal choice and personal responsibility kind of runs counter to the academic approach of sort of pontification from afar. If one is really going to integrate this knowledge in a meaningful way at this level, it requires an individual grasp, an individual participation to really make it meaningful. And from that perspective, the law, though it may be afoul of socio-cultural standards, will not, in fact, as Jay-Z also said, won't be violated. It will be supported and strengthened because it's done so rather than from an outside authoritative position. It's done so from an internal adherence. Amit touched upon this as well when he said, in response, I think, to Susan's question about the history, the long tradition. That was Connie's question, I believe. The Vedantic tradition. You know, those were practitioners/scientists in this field, and they didn't understand that or apprehend that knowledge by simply standing back and speculating about it. It was an empirical understanding which they had to reach.
Okay, thank you to our
panelists. Basil is saying about, in other words, quantum mechanics runs out when you run out of time and space, and that there has to be, there's something beyond that element that he calls...
Quantum mechanics turns out that exactly means the same thing as I'm talking about in logical impossibility. See, consciousness is outside of quantum mechanics. Has to be in order to be the collapser, in order for us to be the observer, in order for us to have free will. So there we are all agreeing, I think. This slight thing that I was trying to clarify is important because one has to recognize what you said to be the correct position about consciousness, that consciousness is all. Therefore, nothing is outside consciousness in that sense. On the other hand, there is a transcendent aspect of consciousness, which is where things become somewhat intricate, because transcendence is both in and out. And therefore, this concept, it has to be used in a rather subtle way and may produce difficulties. For example, I thought what you reacted to was that you thought we are restricting consciousness to free space, which I don't think we are. Okay?
Okay.
It's headwaters. And that when we look at the concept of gravity, that we're actually studying an intangible phenomenon that is most akin to willful intent upon the Creator's part. Now, the Creator, again, let me point out, is any and every individual, that there is an overall mind to reality that has held this reality into an intentional plan. And therein, I think gravity, along with the strong and weak nuclear forces, all come together to represent, in a spiritual context, the word will. And that consciousness is the very thing of time fluctuations, that it is the very element to where quantum mechanics begins and ends and moves into free space. And having said that, then, I could say that the way that I've been taught about how to create something out of nothing is that I have to be able to visualize in my carnal neural net the concept that nothing can be as visual to me as an undulating field of energy. If he has a problem with energy being in terms of relevant to particle activity, and he sees it as an unfolding or an infolding back into the implicate order, he is also correct. It's just in my mind, and not as brilliant as these esteemed professors here, I have to see an action, that from that action I can lay the thought in and see the action become molded to the pattern of my thought.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you, if you want to make a short concluding statement, and then we'll take a break. Anybody want to go first? Respond to...
Go ahead.
To Jay-Z. As you were completely right about consciousness, of course. When I was referring to Basil's free space, I was not referring to consciousness being confined to free space, of course not. What I was referring to is that when you do the mathematics, at some point, a logical impasse will arise. And it was at that point that concepts such as free space would come in, and that logical impasse, again, would have the window for consciousness to come into the picture. But do you
understand what...
But Jay-Z, in terms of what that means to you and what that means as you understand Ramtha's imperatives on teaching us how to do that, how would you explain it?
Well, first I would like to address pre-space, Basil's terminology of pre-space, to where he refers to Ahmed as that's the realm that you can find consciousness in. I agree, but I also disagree, because if consciousness is only located in a place that is outside time and space, then we have no understanding as to the mind quality that brought about the concepts of deterministic manifestation, nor do we have a mind that is able to justify time and space, or at least endeavor to justify time and space, and to try to figure out how all of this got here. In my simplistic mind, consciousness is the ground of all being, and that pre-space is, and that energy carries with it a potential signature, that I don't see random particles falling like snowfall from pre-space, and from that randomness of particles, suddenly there is a coagulation of fields that brings about my desire. Rather, and for me, for my visual concept, I see rather that it's an energy, and that from that energy is pliable to the conscious thought that's given to it. So in my mind, I see energy fields undulating and then collapsing into particle form, having a nucleus of information that allows them to be bound together, and bound together by gravity, strong and weak nuclear forces. And that constitutes, that thing constitutes my desire of creation.
Made tangible.
Made tangible. But again, if consciousness and energy is everything, then Basil is also correct when he says that he has a problem with energy. I mean, the electron all they contract is the cloud of it.